So I wanted to describe the basic setup I use for like lab work, home lab work, and SMD rework. I'm by no means professional, but I sometimes do a bit of firmware development and play with like prototype PCBs, and I have to do a bit of rework on PCBs and stuff. So this is the lab I use, and it's pretty reasonable for doing things like switching out resistors or even pulling out a quad flat pack CPU and replacing it, something like that. Okay, so I'm going to describe the basic kind of lab stuff first, I think, and then the more SMD type stuff. So the first thing you need is obviously a bench supply. It's a very basic bench supply. It goes up to 10 volts. The things you want in the bench supply are current limiting and obviously decent voltage control. This one was about Ichiman N, which is about $100. So that's second hand in Akihabara, so you can get them fairly cheaply. Have a very basic Handtech scope, which goes up to 60 megahertz. I believe they can actually be hacked to go up to something like 120 megahertz, but I've not done that. I haven't had the need to do that yet. So very basic scope. Then of course multimeter. This is a Sanwa multimeter, which cost me around $60–70. Again, picked up in Akihabara. And then soldering iron. This is FX888, which I think is pretty, it's like basically the kind of soldering iron that you get for most hobby work or even professional work. I think the EV blog guy uses it pretty much exclusively. So in a soldering iron you want temperature control, so 350 is probably the temperature that you'll normally work at, and you may want to whack it up when you're like soldering to a ground plane or something, but you don't want it very hot for normal work because you'll lift pads off the boards, and particularly for surface mount work, it's a real pain. I also have just picked up this FX600 recently, which is, I've been doing a lot of travelling, so this is nice to have as a soldering iron that you can kind of put in your bag and carry around. Also is temperature controlled. It takes the same tips as the FX888. And in particular, you want to be getting a flat-tipped soldering iron, so you can make contact with both the pad and the component that you're soldering to. So I think that's really useful. Again, the EV blog has a really great video on soldering irons and soldering technique generally. So, okay, yeah, some more basic type stuff. So, wire cutters. You want to get flat-sided wire cutters so you can kind of get in there and get a nice clean cut. I'm really partial to Hosan tools. They're really nice. Pincery things for just bending legs of components. It's always handy. Decent set of wire strippers. It's worth having. Then solder. Basically, you get kind of the finest solder that you can find, particularly for SMD work, possibly for any work. It's really handy. It lets you precisely control the amount of solder you're going to use. And again, this stuff is really useful, which is wire wrap wire, which is very thin gauge wire, which lets you do fix-ups on PCBs and you can do things like solder directly to the legs of 0.5mm pitch connectors and CPUs and things. You also want some solder braid, and again, this is really like particularly useful for SMD stuff, for cleaning up pads and that kind of thing. If there's a bunch of solder on the board because you just removed the component, stick some flux down, use a solder braid to clean up the pad. Which, yeah, probably brings us to flux. So there are flux pens, which are really handy, really convenient. So flux just helps the solder flow onto the component and generally flow. So with this you can just kind of touch some flux down, so when you're soldering a new component, stick some flux on the board. Basically always stick some flux on the board. You can also get it in a kind of bottle form, which lets you really throw flux around, which comes in with a little brush, yeah, so you can just brush it onto the board. And then you tend to place your component, put a bit of solder down, place your component, maybe throw some more flux down, and then get it all to flow on. Screwdriver, obviously. For SMD work, you really want really basic microscope. So this is really just a hobby microscope. I mean, I think it's like something they sell to high schools for just looking at bits of water and stuff. So it's really basic. But they also sell it in the electronics shops in Akihabara for PCB inspection. And I've kind of hacked this one around a bit, so the surface wasn't quite flat, so I stuck a bit of cardboard down, so this nice flat surface, and I've kind of hot glued a light ring onto it so that I can illuminate the component that I'm looking at. So you basically just stick the PCB that you're working on under the microscope and do some rework, get your tweezers under there, place components, and do soldering under the microscope. I think a really nice set of tweezers is a good thing to have for SMD rework. I probably spent like way too much money on tweezers, but these looked cool, and I have a collection of tweezers that I think look cool now that I don't really use. But these are about $30, and they're nice. They don't have much. They don't seem to take static, so you can get with really small components, you can get the components sticking to the tweezers sometimes, just which is really annoying. So these tweezers don't seem to do that, and they're really nice. These are Rubis tweezers. I could make an entire video about the money that I've wasted on tweezers. So once you've got your component down, you've used a hell of a lot of flux, so there's like flux everywhere probably. So it's worth having flux cleaner to remove the flux, clean up the board. Maybe when you're like stripping some old components off a board, you'd throw your flux down and pull the components off, and then clean up the board with solder braid. But then you'd clean the board with flux cleaner, and you can really clean up the board nicely, so it looks like almost new. It's brilliant. So I think that's everything. I think the only thing I haven't mentioned is a function generator, which is, again, this is a small, because I'm moving around a lot, this is a small portable function generator, not particularly fascinating, but does the job. So I think that's it, really. Thanks very much.